We are now live, Cloud Native After Dark. Who's this guy?
I'm Zach. I work at Pivotal. I
So-
write stuff.
So what do you do, Zach?
I'm an engineer on the release integration team. So I'm responsible for Cloud Foundry release, basically. I work with 5 other pretty awesome people and a PM who together collectively, we're the team responsible for CF release and a bunch of tools around how you deploy and run and manage CF release.
So earlier on Twitter, you were complaining about some article about cloud computing.
Ars Technica has this habit of, HP or Microsoft, somebody's like paid them money to say the word Azure like 10 times in an article. So they write some article that's like the cloud. And then, in it, they say Azure or Helion or something in it like a bunch of times. And the article itself has zero substance. And as somebody who, I spend all day like writing software to be deployed on the cloud, I find it to be this sort of almost offensive simplification of what the concept of the cloud enables for developers and operators and even consumers.
So yeah. you must be new here.
Yeah.
What you're trying to tell me is that someone wrote a piece with an agenda and then they published it.
That's basically what I'm upset about. Yeah.
And we got your cat is the star of the show.
He gets upset if he hasn't been the center of attention for more than like 10 minutes or so. Come here, buddy.
He's all, yeah, let's do this.
Mm-hmm. Cloud Foundry After Dark featuring Copernicus.
So, having not read that, I couldn't be bothered to click the link or read what you read. But
yeah, man. You didn't miss anything.
No, I mean, and I've been reading that kind of stuff for the last. Oh man, we're coming up on. It's been almost a decade since Amazon Web Services was first launched.
Mm-hmm.
So that will happen next year. But that stuff's, cloud washing or whatever you want to call it is not a new phenomenon. But maybe it's worth, because you said you wanted to write something, right? So you're like, so one, I'm going to make you do that, not necessarily tonight. But what were the things that you would want someone to think about or think more clearly about if you were so inclined to write an article? So
I'm just going to pull up the article right now. And really what I think the power of the cloud is in, and I am an unashamed, very biased lover of Cloud Foundry. I think the power of that is in the way it enables people to interact with software, both from like I said, from a development perspective and an operation perspective, and then even again on a consumer perspective. And so what we're not talking about is the fact that the idea of the cloud, and really what I mean is virtualization on certain levels. The idea of that enables rapid scaling of your software. It enables you to suddenly, and we talk a lot about microservices, but it really enables that. It enables you to deploy and build things in that distributed, single-purpose, stateless architecture that sort of eluded us for years because it was actually hard to manage.
Right, and so I think that's one of the things that is core. And you just sort of said virtualization, but virtualization existed in many forms before there was anything cloudy, right?
I guess what I want to say is that people really think of the cloud as like AWS, Azure, whatever HP has, like. But that also can be vSphere or OpenStack in your data center. And I want to say that like what matters is the idea of on-demand VMs.
On-demand resources. Right?
Sure, yeah.
I think VMs is actually somewhat limiting, but VMs is a common thing that people are familiar with. That certainly was where the Amazon started. they're kind of ahead of that curve now with some of the stuff they're offering. But what I think is key is that you have resources that are available through an API, that you have some sort of meaningful abstraction, which usually at the bottom comes down to some sort of abstraction for compute, networking, and storage. And depending on what you're trying to do, where you're at in your kind of focus. So I think there's interesting things that look suspiciously like building a platform, right?
Certainly.
Like go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I was just to close it off. I think that cloud, and this is where this kind of cloud native conversation comes in, is it's much about how you do things as where you do them, right? And so it's one thing to say Amazon, and certainly there's movement there. Azure's got adoption. Google even has people using their cloud. But at the end of the day, there's an architectural paradigm that predates those things. I remember being, in the Puppet project, working with people who basically had on-demand API-driven provisioning of all their infrastructure in their data center back in 2008.
Sure.
Like that was just table stakes, right? And what we saw with Amazon was really the first ones to connect the dots. And obviously we have some heritage there with some of the people that work inside Pivotal, but the notion, okay, like this is something that we have as a competitive advantage, but we can also use this as a productized offering, and making that leap from, we're really good at running a massive web infrastructure, and in order to do that in a what we're kind of referring to as cloud native now, we need to be able to do these things on demand with APIs. So why don't we just take those APIs and put some way to meter them, and we'll charge people money to use that infrastructure.
Sure.
And it seems to be working.
Hello.
So,
Rich Grant, this is one of my.
yeah, I'm leaving. I just wanted to say hi.
Hi.
Later, man.
Cheers. That's one of my my good friends from ages ago, who must have seen the social media link that I posted.
The tweet.
He's like, just saying hi.
I think really like what we're talking about is exactly that, where like the concepts of microservices, the concepts of infrastructure as code, these things have existed before OpenStack. These things have existed before AWS, but what we're seeing now is with the plethora of options in the cloud is suddenly people are enabled to use these in ways they really weren't able to use them before, from a very small scale to a very large scale. And so that's the really, I think, beautiful thing about this is that, right, I was working at a small startup in the tech healthcare field where, they had one operator and 6 engineers and me, the intern. And they were able to scale to, 3 instances on AWS using S3 as their block store. Like, from that, where before they would have had to buy servers or bare metal or manage actual VPSs instead of thinking of them as just interchangeable instances on a random cloud. And all of these things now, that's enabling this small industry, this small startup level where they had Series A, but even before that, they were just seed funded, less than $1 million. That kind of thing is fundamentally the big change that the cloud is driving. Is it's sort of democratized and commoditized these previously only available to people with at-scale data center tools.
Absolutely, and I think there's a gradient, there's an evolution. So the first wave, the first bubble, if you will, there was a process that you either went to Sun or you went to Dell, and you got hardware. You got at $8,000 to $10,000 a piece. You got servers. And you put them in a data center, and then if you were sophisticated enough to know what accounting is, you amortize them over 3 or 4 years or whatever, and you did something this looks very, very different than what you can do when you have an API that will give you a server for, less than 10 cents an hour now on the bottom end.
Right.
So that's definitely game changing. But I also think that it's there's these things that are obvious in retrospect, but they're not always obvious as you're approaching that kind of singularity. But like all primates, we're tool users, and you see there's all sorts of little papers where someone observes these patterns in nature, and once the monkeys see one monkey figure out how to use the tool to open that thing that's a new source of food, then fairly rapidly that information, that knowledge spreads through the group, and then that's something everyone just takes for granted, that you can just do that. And I think that's what we're seeing here is a paradigm shift to these new architectures, these new approaches, new models for risk, new models for everything. It's very exciting, actually.
Right. And I guess to go back to the article, where the article sort of starts with like a brief history of the cloud and how virtual machines were invented, to here's the list of current cloud providers that conveniently starts with Azure and HP, to like, by the way, Rackspace is also trying and OpenStack exists, to that's it, that's what the cloud is. And you're like, well, that had no substance. We're not actually talking about why the cloud is the thing to be talking about in 2015. Like,
did it really exclude Amazon?
They gave Amazon the sort of cursory AWS is also the thing that everybody's actually using little blurb. Like, there's a paragraph in there about Amazon, I think, but really it was like, it reads a lot like Helion product placement, which is fine, right?
So one of the things that I've said, and I say this about a lot of things, but you can pick your favorite buzzword and replace it. I said it about DevOps, I said it about cloud, but you get the microservices you deserve, right? You get the cloud, whatever the buzzword is that you deserve. So there's always going to be people with agendas, and there's always going to be some flow of whatever, quid pro quo, if you will. But the way that you look at the landscape, and you just talked about how this changes the dynamics of this kind of low end, let's get started with cloud, let's try an idea. What's the risk? It totally de-risk the experimentation that you need to do to validate basic product ideas. But the thing that especially from kind of a Cloud Foundry perspective, that's interesting is what is the dynamic on the enterprise side, where you've already got considerable capital expense into data centers. You've already got legacy applications that you're running, in many cases, literally billions of dollars through. What is your path? What is your smooth sailing to this kind of new, bright, cloudy future that you want to participate in?
I think it starts with people, where, right, like it's like you said, this at this scale, there is no risk. There is no, right, like, my girlfriend is an accountant, and she tells me about like doing accounting for these companies where they say there's material and immaterial, and $15 million is immaterial. It's like money that if it's gone missing, they don't even look at. They don't even care. So
yeah.
So for that, like at that scale, $15 million of hardware in a data center is like, oh yeah, that little team can just use it for a month and who cares? And so what now the idea of the cloud at this scale is enabling is people. It's enabling developers to write better software faster. And so sure, they've got all this legacy stuff that, they need to maybe wrap or re-architect a little bit to run on whatever cloud they put on top of their hardware, OpenStack or VMware or whatever. But the movement forward suddenly becomes, we can put small teams of developers on a small project and they can iterate quickly. And we hear this from our clients where, they deploy Cloud Foundry, or even they just put VMware on their system, and they go from, we submit a help desk ticket that has a 6-month turnaround and we get a VM, to we run a single command on our command line and we have 10 more instances of our software running. And that's a fundamentally human benefit. And it benefits the humans developing the software, and it benefits the humans operating the software, and it benefits the humans using the software. And the company culture there has to change and orient itself around the idea that you no longer have to wait that 6 months to get a VM.
The way I think about this and frame this in conversation is, and I think there's a flip of a switch that happens when a company that has built a business, has a legacy that is somewhat dependent on IT, but is not necessarily considering themselves a software company, not necessarily considering themselves a technology company. When they realize what a competitive advantage or potentially disadvantage software capabilities are in their different markets, and then they get very motivated to try to enable and change this. But going back to the point you were making about what is an amount of money when you have an IT expenditure that, even if it's in millions, if that's a small line item on what's essentially a massive budget to do whatever your core business is, then I think that, and you see this and you hear people talk about it this way, that you have this self-fulfilling prophecy of treating IT capability as a cost center. Mm-hmm. And that's gone on for, in some cases, decades. Many cases that that we deal with in our customer base for decades, and now they're trying to figure out how to take and to kind of come back full circle to the point you were making, unlock that inherent creative spirit inside of their own people, right? And you constantly, in conversations I'm having, you hear from these enterprise cultures that they don't have the talent, they can't attract the talent, they can't retain the talent to build this kind of software, to build these kind of architectures. And I think that that's self-fulfilling in the sense that they have the talent in many cases already. They're not enabling the talent that already sits inside of their building.
Right. And I think that's like, this is the second, right? The first fundamental benefit of the cloud to me is this idea that it's sort of democratizing the data center, or maybe not democratizing, but certainly commoditizing. And the second fundamental benefit is that it's making people happy. It's humans who use it become happier by virtue of having used it. And I think that's like, this is like making, CF push is so cool.
I mean, I don't want to debate this point, but I'm not sure happy is the word that I would use. I do think there's a joy that humans get that is inherently connected to creating, and it gives you the ability, it enables this ability to create. But it's not always fun either, right? Like even especially as you take personal pride in what you're building, and there's still outages in the cloud, right? There's still like all this other responsibility.
I'm not saying you immediately become like a self-actualized, happy, never ever had a negative thought in your head person. I'm just saying that.
Because I want that. Let's do that.
Yeah, I mean, I want that too. It's a trek. There's a mountain somewhere that you can climb and pass 3 riddles and you'll find it. But really what I'm talking about now is like, you don't have to slog through the mess that is Capistrano. You don't have to submit a help desk ticket. You don't have to do any of that. And there's this sort of like grin that comes from, like, it comes on my face when I type Bosch deploy and then I walk away and I do something else and I come back and it's just there, and I check in my deployment to my repo and then somebody says, oh, well, put it on vSphere. Do what we just did on Amazon on vSphere. And I change 3 lines of YAML and I do it again and it just works. There's no more slog. And it's not perfect, right? It's always improving, and Bosch's user experience is by no means amazing. But I think that that's the thing is the parts of operating software that are frustrating are slowly being removed by what the cloud enables us to do.
So I have a few theories about human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And one of them is that they kind of need like a constant level of conflict and drama in their lives. So there will be a generation of developers who, you know, the only thing they really know, like they're born after the creation of Lambda, after the creation of Amazon Web Services, after the creation of Cloud Foundry. And they'll have plenty of things to be frustrated about. It just won't be like that you know, build a cluster, scale the cluster problem that we're all excited about right now.
Sure. But this is the problem that we're excited about right now. So there's some happiness to be gained in solving it. And I think that that's...
But I'm saying the happiness comes from the creation. Like you get to create things, and then it's like a testament to that human will and spirit to create. That's what I feel like is fulfilling.
Sure. But you know, and I agree with you. And I think back to, like, you know, my freshman year in college learning Rails from like the Hartle tutorial. And I hope I'm pronouncing that name right because I'm terrible at butchering names. But you know, so I built a pretty simple app that was, you know, for a class, I can't remember, and I did a Heroku push. And this is before, or at least I knew about Cloud Foundry. And it was like, you know, I had been going through these things like how to spin a Rails app up on DigitalOcean. First you get a server, then you SSH onto the server, then you get Nginx, then you do this, and what's Fusion Passenger? And I was like, no, there's an easier way to do this, I'm sure. And it turns out that you can just type git push Heroku, and then your code runs. And that was like mind-blowing to me.
So did you ever have to deal with Mongrel?
No, see, this is what I'm saying, is I don't even know what that is. Like, I know it's a web server, but like, you know, I think about the pain that my colleagues at Pivotal who did have to deal with Mongrel experienced, and how sort of joyful I was when I did Heroku push, and then there was my code running, and that was easy, awesome. So that's what we're doing. That's what we're enabling.
So the reason I keep dragging this back to this notion of creativity, and like that's what's inspiring to humans, is that's actually the key to solving the talent problem. Mm-hmm. That if you have a culture where you don't think you can attract and retain talent, then you haven't connected the talent to a mission, to creating something.
Yeah, and I think we're sort of loudly agreeing with each other, which is that, right, like that joy came from the fact that there were very few barriers between creating something and then experiencing my creation in motion. And what these companies that we're talking about, who are just now, you know, they have a talent pool that they are now beginning to realize is not just a cost center, but it's something they can leverage in really amazing ways. They need to start removing these barriers from their creativity to the application of that creativity. And that's what we're enabling. And in a way, right, like, this is what I get so freaking pumped about, is the fact that the tool that I build enables that. And when, you know, there's the people who aren't sold yet, but I've yet to meet somebody who said, I tried it really hard for 2 months and then hated it after all that time. You know, the stories we hear are, after I got over the hump of that paradigm shift, which is necessary in order to really think about software in a cloud native way, I'm never going back. That's the story that we hear, and nothing makes me smile more.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a, you know, and this goes back to personal fulfillment. When someone tells you that your product helped them do something, like, that's really fulfilling.
Yeah, absolutely.
So unless you have other points you wanted to drag out of that article, let's change the topic and think of.
I'm fine. Move on.
So I'm just curious, the vantage point you have working on the release team, you know, and watching what you see with whatever landscape. That's both an interesting place because it's sort of central to everything going on in Cloud Foundry, but then not always. I don't know if you guys always get to see, the customers and everything else as close as some of the other groups. So I'm just curious what you think about things going on in Cloud Foundry, like what you think is exciting, what you think could be better. Just kind of get a perspective from someone who's sitting in a different chair than we usually have on this.
So, first of all, I'm on an open source team, which is uplifting and depressing in the same time. And recently we had an issue opened against the CF Release GitHub that basically said, I've been trying to deploy Cloud Foundry for 2 months and it's too hard and I can't do it. Please help me. And that's such a hard thing to read, because here's this labor of love for so many people that it's such a big, hard, distributed system that here we are inside the building with all this context. We know how to deploy it. We know how to write a BOSH manifest. We know how to debug the possibilities that come up. I think that's the biggest hurdle, and our team is really dedicated to solving this, and I can get to what we're doing in a little bit. But I think really that's the biggest problem facing Cloud Foundry right now, is that it's hard to bootstrap. It's hard for somebody to come to it and say, I'm a developer operator. I have some basic understanding of distributed systems, but really I know Rails, or really my area of expertise is Django, whatever, and they want to come and they want to say, I want to leverage the fact that my company has a data center that can run a platform as a service. I want to enable my team to really use this to its fullest extent, and I can't deploy Cloud Foundry.
I mean, this is where it gets interesting, and there's a bunch of kind of historical reasons, and I think there's a mix of practical and maybe, I don't know, I don't want to get into the history of Cloud Foundry right now, but the separation of BOSH, which is actually a platform itself. And I think that's one of the things that makes the Cloud Foundry onboarding, where if you're a developer and you want to try Cloud Foundry, there's ways you can do that for free, at least as a trial, and also for free on some other things perpetually, although you're probably not going to be able to build anything with real substance until you start paying a little bit. But the experience as an operator trying to get Cloud Foundry set up in the first place, trying to get before you can get Elastic Runtime set up, you have to get BOSH set up, right? Mm-hmm. And then once you have BOSH set up, if you know how to do it, then BOSH is really nice, but it has some sharp edges, and that barrier to getting that kind of first taste, what I call the mean time to dopamine, is a really, really, really long period compared to what you're going to do to dump dopamine with some of the other projects that are out there that are trying to do, different types of cloud native components.
Yeah. I think so this ties back into, I think, one of the really uplifting parts of what I do, which is our team has been given the mandate of A, make CF Release easier to deploy. B, make deploying CF Release automatable. And C, figure out a better way to write BOSH manifests. And there's others too, and I don't want to misrepresent the goals of this team, but those are the things that are really in our backlog right now. And so the uplifting part comes from, we wrote a bunch of CloudFormation templates. And this is, again, a little AWS-centric, but we're working on opportunities to port all of this tooling to vSphere and OpenStack as well. For now, it's AWS-centric. But what we built are these CloudFormation templates. And right now they're Bash, but the goal is that they're eventually Go. That basically you type, mega tool, deploy Cloud Foundry. And you give it an AWS access key, which represents an IAM user with admin rights to an AWS account. And it uses CloudFormation to create a VPC, to create a subnet, to create all the buckets you need, as well as an IAM user with bucket-specific privileges. And then it, it creates all of that, creates the key pairs, blah, 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 creates a manifest, uses Bosch init to deploy your microBosch, and finally spits out a manifest that can be used to deploy CF with no other effort to that VPC with a Bosch running in it that you just ran. And this is a tool that existed in some form, and we're now reworking it in Golang. But that is where we want the future of deploying Cloud Foundry to go from a bootstrapping perspective.
Yeah, and I know all the words you just said, and I think a few people who watch this might know those words too. But I think that there's so many, like a lot of the times when we communicate in jargon that's really dense and meaningful, semantically rich and meaningful, but it's hard for the newcomer to really understand what's going on, right? And so when you start to explain, well, you need to bootstrap Bosch with the microBosch before you can install Cloud Foundry, they're just like, what is going on? I don't understand.
So I guess sort of at the end of the day, I'm not even going to try to explain everything I just said, but what the point is that our goal is that you won't need me to. You won't need to know it. All you'll need to do is start with the defaults. Our tool will get you everything you need to deploy Cloud Foundry. And from there, move on to, okay, our tool lets you modify primitives, whatever they are, and whatever jargon you want to use to name these primitives, but network settings or instance types, all of these things.
So we have a question from our listening audience.
Yeah.
And it looks like Tishar might join us, so I'm going to send the link.
That's awesome.
So we were asked if it would be possible to make the footprint on Amazon smaller.
Yeah, we get asked this a lot. We recently ran through a number of stories to use smaller instance types for the Cloud Controller and a number of the other VMs UAA, which you can check out in our public backlog. Hey, Tushar. The short answer is we consider this something that's very important and have done the research to determine that what we have set in our defaults in CF release, or the manifests that we can generate automatically for you, are the smallest deployment of Cloud Foundry you can get that will work. And that's an important thing.
So I actually think that's the wrong answer.
You think that's the wrong answer? Okay.
And I'll tell you
why I'm wrong.
And I really hope we can get this into our culture in the way that we respond to lots of things that happen on mailing lists, and it hurts me that we don't have more of a public Slack channel right now. But what I really think we need to be able to do is talk about what are the trade-offs, right? Like, don't just assert, oh, this is what works. Like, what if you change some of these things, right? What if you went to less of these, less redundancy, whatever? Like, you could make something work. What are the promises that you can keep if you go to this alternative footprint, right? That's the way that I think we should have that discussion.
I agree with you completely. So let me rephrase. We make a number of promises about Cloud Foundry. HA, it'll pass CATs, essentially. And I could see if acceptance test is basically a suite of tests that we run against Cloud Foundry that determine for us this is an operational and usable Cloud Foundry that we can certify this works. And so let's start breaking promises. If you want to start breaking promises, let's start with the Cloud Controller. You can absolutely deploy a slower Cloud Controller.
I mean, what about a promise where I just want to have that Cloud Foundry experience, right? Like, I don't need to run it in production. I just want to see what it's like to deploy a few apps.
Well, then you know what you should do? You should do it in a single VM. Use our script to deploy Bosch Lite. And I say this, I maybe this sounds a little bit like, oh, well, then what you should do, and I don't mean it that way. I genuinely mean, like, absolutely, you can do this with Bosch Lite. You want to deploy 3 apps and just see what it's like? You can do that in a single VM by deploying a Bosch Light to Amazon and putting Cloud Foundry on it.
Yeah, the point I would like to put into really all of the Cloud Foundry teams is getting to understand what these trade-offs are and articulating them internally and externally, because I just think it will help the community understand what those trade-offs are and why these are our opinions for these reasons, instead of just asserting like this is what will work.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right, and I appreciate you telling me why I'm wrong.
I mean, in some ways you're not wrong. Like, I just don't think that's the best answer. Right?
And I agree, and I think you're right about changing the way we explain why we've made the decisions about what our defaults are.
Well, because I read quite a bit of our mailing list. Probably not, like, I don't go deep on every single list because there's tons of stuff going on all the time, but I try to keep up with what's going on. And I feel like sometimes we have opportunity from a Cloud Foundry community perspective to engage people and have conversations about how we understand this thing, what we're thinking about. Like, there's this thoughtful approach to why this is architected this way, but we lose those opportunities because we just say, oh, we thought it through, it's all figured out, and like we're done.
Right.
How are you doing, Tushar?
I'm good. So based on this, I actually
you got your Carnegie Mellon hoodie on.
Yeah. So I actually was thinking that like Cloud Foundry as a whole distributed system doesn't have any strong these many, like if you run a Cloud Foundry with 5 APIs versus 10 API nodes, how performance varies and what is the HA experience, and like basically how do you give like real numbers to back your claims of certain things, right? There's no
Yes. So
way.
It seems like your Wi-Fi is struggling just a little bit, but what I got out of that, and I think you're 100% right, is like what's actually been characterized, right? What kind of test, not from kind of like the unit test-driven development perspective, but from a benchmarking or a bunch of different scenarios that you apply against a cluster, and then be able to categorize the promises that you can keep with that kind of configuration. And I think that is, I mean, I know we've done some of that, and I've seen some of that, but I think it's a huge opportunity, and the way that it's been pursued right now hasn't been as kind of, I don't know, systematic as or scientific as you might like.
Well, and this is again one of the reasons this team exists and was split off from the old runtime team, which had the responsibility of maintaining the runtime and the routing system and CF release as a whole. Now there's just the CF release team, and one of our goals is to actually start being scientific about how we certify these claims we make about the operationality of operationalness, whatever.
Operability is
That's the word.
Yeah.
Of Cloud Foundry. And so, like one of the things we're talking about in the maybe not near future, but coming up is a, what do they call it, chaos lemur type thing where like kill a VM at random, does your cluster still operate? And another one we're talking about is all of our environments that we use for testing are named after sauces. So the next one we really plan on building is called Molasses, and the goal is, what if you don't restart your VMs because you did a deploy, once every few days? What if you let that run for 3 weeks? Do we have memory leaks? Do we have situations where things are restarting randomly and we don't necessarily notice this because we deploy fast enough that we get to them before these processes do? And there's definitely so much more science that can happen in how we certify CF release that we're just now embarking on.
I mean, in some ways, you kind of have to build the thing before you can science the thing, right? And so we're getting to the point where, especially with the effort to get to Diego as the core scheduling and a bunch of the other stuff that went on, that now becomes possible, right? It probably was premature to do all of that before, but I definitely am excited. here's another thing, and I think this might resonate with. I've said it before on Cloud Foundry After Dark, but I would really like to see Bosch capturing metrics from the underlying infrastructure provider, and then doing that in a way that those could be shared. Because what I would really like to do, what I would really like Cloud Foundry to be able to do, and as you see, and you've already mentioned what, like 5 different clouds in our earlier conversation. Like if you could say definitively, based on metrics, this is what's happening underneath this thing with respect to API calls, stillborn VMs just disappearing, like network going away, like all the stuff that happens on a regular basis on a cloud. If you could categorize that, quantify that, and publish those metrics, I think that kind of transparency would be potentially transformative for the whole industry.
If you're deployed to AWS, all you'll get out of it is everything is fine.
No, that's what they tell you, right?
I'm
like
just saying, if you're getting Bosch, if they're telling Bosch that.
No, but VMs disappear on Amazon, right?
Oh yeah, and VMs lock up for reasons that we're pretty sure aren't our fault. Yeah, there's all sorts of things that we would love to be finding out that we at least hope we can blame on the infrastructure.
What I'm saying at this level, as a first pass, like you don't have to blame anyone, right? And it could be beneficial when it's tracked down to characterize our software as well. Like what's actually happened? Just capture those metrics. Like, oh, this locked up. Like that should be an event, and that should be. I think it would be awesome. It's been on my mind for a while.
Yeah. I think that, like I said, we're now beginning to really take a much more scientific, dedicated approach to how we certify Cloud Foundry. And it's a long road. We've got now an exploratory tester on the team, and she's been really pretty fundamentally amazing at helping us qualify how we're planning these explorations and tests. And that's fantastic because we finally have a way of describing internally, and then also for people reading our backlog, what are we testing, how are we testing it, what are our goals, what are the constraints. And this is sort of, we're good at writing tests in RSpec or in Ginkgo, but we're not good at defining exploration. And so now we're beginning to really explore all of these ways that we certify Cloud Foundry and develop Cloud Foundry, and the future is bright.
Interesting. Just out of curiosity, could you maybe give the top 2 or 3 examples of exploratory stuff that you thought was interesting or changed your perspective?
So, well, like I said, we started with when we got the QA question, which was, okay, can we make the footprint smaller? That was a story that we had recently. The story started as written was figure out smaller instance types, or something along those lines. And when the exploratory tester got her hands on it, it was awesome. She rewrote that. Explore smaller instance types for Cloud Foundry running on Amazon with the goal of reducing cost, and measure by seeing what the increase in CPU and memory footprint is after deploying Cloud Foundry with smaller instance types for these 4 jobs. And just the fact that we have somebody who's thinking, here's how we need to constrain and here's how we need to define our exploration of things has been a huge benefit to us, especially our team, because this is part of our mandate. Explore CF release for ways that we can improve it. And this is just the beginning, but I think that the way we now look at these stories is with this much sort of narrower view, and that's a benefit to us because it means that we have the ability to begin thinking about Cloud Foundry as something we apply science to in all of the ways that we test and certify it. And so this is part of that science is, okay, let's measure these exact metrics on these exact jobs and come up with a quantifiable way of saying, yes, we can certify this smaller instance type.
Someone talking to you?
No, just
Distraction.
I'm super distractible. There's a cat here.
There you go.
Boop, boop. He's got little beans. He doesn't
So-
like it when I tickle his feet.
So that was one example. What else was other than just sort of the reframing, and that made me curious what you guys were thinking before, or girls too. I suppose there's I don't know who's on your team, but
We're a multicultural team of people, and it's awesome.
so not to change topics, but let's
No.
change topic for 1 second, just
Yeah.
because I thought it was interesting. I've been to a lot of conferences,
Mm-hmm.
tech conferences, probably at least a dozen a year for the last 6-7 years, and we have a problem in our cultural whatever technology industry that it's not very friendly. It's not very inviting, and we've basically driven women out of it. But then if you start to actually look at the numbers, like it's even worse for minorities in many respects. So you know what the Bechdel test is?
I do. It's do two named female characters in a movie have a conversation with each other about anything other than a boy in that movie.
So there's this was a tweet from earlier today that I retweeted, but I think it's sort of related to this notion. And it says the Bechdel test for tech conferences. Number 1, 2 women are speaking. Number two on the same panel, and number 3, it's not about women in tech.
So I want to frame this conversation the fact that I am a white male cishet. Like, as far as being diverse, I'm a 0. I have 0 diversity points. And so from that, I also have very little experience being anything other than a very privileged person. I had a privileged upbringing. I work in a place of privilege in a privileged field. So my conversation about this is framed in the idea that I am somebody who really cares deeply about improving the situation, and am speaking from a place of empathy and sympathy, but not necessarily experience that I've had. And I think that's important to note, because there are people who are certainly more qualified to speak about the experiences of women or people of color in tech than me. But I'm here, and I care about this, and I care about solving this problem, which is that tech is an incredibly unwelcome place for people of color, for women, for people who have different gender identities or different sexualities. Any of these things, tech is incredibly unfriendly, and we see that expressed in all sorts of ways. Where and I've forgotten her name. Where the lead developer on the USB 3 driver for the Linux kernel just recently quit because the Linux community is just toxic.
Well, so this is one of the things I was thinking about a little bit, and I think this might be, I don't know, I'd love to get some discussion with, especially people with a little more diversity than the conversation we're going to have right now.
Right.
But I reflect on a bunch of stuff I've seen, and in some ways I think that it's actually just hostile. Like the environment's just hostile, and it's hostile in general, but if you're not kind of in that core privileged group, then like it's easier to just like bag it and like, let's go do something a little less, or the flip side of that is maybe they're actually the smart ones for leaving.
I think that you're definitely right about the fact that, yeah, the environment's totally hostile, and we even see this at Pivotal, for instance, where there are things like ping pong and beer are a huge part of that culture, which to people who don't like the definitely sort of like masculine sports, let's play ping pong, I gotta win, competitive, that can be off-putting to people who are not super into like maybe drinking or the sort of culture around that type of drinking, that can be off-putting. And I say this from the perspective of somebody who doesn't drink, where there's a lot of bar culture that I don't necessarily find unwelcoming to me, but I don't participate in. And so I've created my own alternative groups that I hang out with, that I do whatever. But there's all of these things that the people in the privileged group partake in and don't even necessarily see, right? It took me a long time, and it took people actively pointing it out to me that, like, the masculine competitive ping pong culture might not be a welcome thing for everybody who comes to work at Pivotal. And that we should try to make it something that is an option, and try to say, this is, people play ping pong, but there's also people who have a book club, and there's also people who play Go, and there's also people who play Zendo, and there's you know, working to create a culture that's welcoming is something you have to do actively. It's not something that happens because you hired people of color. It's not something that happens because you hired people who don't play ping pong. It's something that you, maybe, right, I love ping pong. It's something that me, as somebody who does play ping pong, has to be thinking about. How can I actively work to include other people in a culture?
Yeah, I think that humans are deeply tribal by nature, and that we're constantly signaling in-group, out-group to each other. Yo.
Hey there.
How'd your deploy go?
It didn't.
Didn't work.
It was actually a Eureka cluster, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. There's a port that's open somewhere that needs to work, but
didn't you have more beard last time we saw you?
Possibly, and probably more hair. It gets cold, so I shave it.
That does not make sense.
Yeah, that's a little backwards.
Yeah, I don't know why I did it, actually. I had it long all summer and then shaved it for the winter.
Do you live in Australia?
What's that?
Do you live in Australia?
No, actually, I'm in Steamboat Springs, so it's
Starting to get cold.
Oh, it's already cold. We've got probably 5-6 inches on the ground, and so far about 3 feet. So.
It's 50 out here in Santa Clara.
Yeah, I live in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
So it's 70 out for you.
Actually, you know, I saw one of your tweets about the temperature, and I think at the time it was like 12 here.
Yeah.
I was actually swimming outside.
Nice. In a lake or in a pool?
In a pool.
Okay.
I mean, it's a heated pool. It's like 90-degree water, but still you're outside.
Yeah, it's like 56 degrees, and people are wearing, they're wearing like what looks like winter gear, and I'm just like, what are you guys doing? I can't even. I mean, I'm ready to wear shorts until it's below zero.
Yeah.
So you were the one who asked about reducing the footprint on Amazon, and then jumped in. So maybe, or you listened to what we were talking about before. Where are you thinking about all this, and
well,
might as well take advantage of the fact you just jumped into.
Yeah, I guess my questions center around. So let's say you fire up this little instance to give it a try. You let Boss do all of its stuff. You set up all your IAM roles and all that. That price tag is like above 20 grand a year for that scenario. Just an EC2.
You're talking about the defaults that we have right now, right?
Exactly. So you're looking at 20K in a yearly model to try it.
So I don't know if you saw what I responded to when Zach was talking about how I think there would be a lot of benefit to Cloud Foundry's ecosystem and Cloud Foundry as a project if we were having more dialogue around like what's the trade-offs, right? So yeah, you have this footprint, and here's the promises you can keep with that. But if you were to tweak certain aspects of the architecture, if you're going to make something less redundant, highly available, whatever, what are the trade-offs? What are the promises you can keep with that reduced footprint? Because I do think there's ways to try Cloud Foundry, but then what is your goal, right? If your goal is to see what it's like to push code and have Cloud Foundry spin up build the build packs and do the containers and spin up some stuff and just see it work, and then that's one thing. If your goal is to be able to make promises about how that infrastructure will be able to respond to certain failures, then that's another. And I think that the thing that people need to realize about the way Cloud Foundry is architected and kind of deployed at that default level right now is it's basically like, hey, here's a Death Star. That's the metaphor I've used before. And sometimes you don't need a Death Star. You just need a space shuttle. You don't need the Death Star.
Well, like in our scenario, it's not necessarily a Death Star, but maybe a one of the Imperial starships or whatever it would be, somewhere in between the space shuttle and the Death Star.
A Star Destroyer.
A Star Destroyer.
So the scenario would be, let's say, deployment to Cloud Foundry. Let's face it, it's pretty easy.
Yeah.
To deploy an app. But what about if I want RabbitMQ in it? What about if I want a database in it? The interactions and things of that nature that happen when you have your own environment, how does that work? And I don't really care at that point necessarily about HA. I don't necessarily care about a lot of the, I guess the full-blown Cloud Foundry resilience perspective. I just want to know how these complicated aspects of it fit into it. That makes sense?
It does, and I also think that it's some of the things that are kind of being, when you look at the Cloud Foundry deployments that we have with our customers and the way that they're being adopted, there's still this sort of nascent workflow to work out, right? And okay, you look at what's available from a developer perspective, CF push, and then from an operator perspective, okay, you have the ability to add this and maybe that, and then now there's some overlap where you're going to add role-based access and you're going to give your developers this thing and quotas and workspaces and all that stuff. Okay, that's interesting and it's thoughtful, but honestly, like from a continuous delivery pipeline perspective, I don't really want developers to have like workflow and spaces. I want everyone to push to CI. Like I want CI to push all this code. Like so, there's a bunch of stuff that's sort of nascent in the way that you have to adopt Cloud Foundry as we learn as a community, kind of like what's the best way to set up these pipelines. What's the best way? I think that there are answers and there's obvious answers, but a lot of times the answers really depend on the context you're trying to solve for, and not as a generic general solution to every problem.
Sure. And like in our case, everything comes out of CI. In our case, it's Bamboo.
Yeah.
Sure.
So Bamboo is pushing everything, and Bamboo's turned into this almost too much of a powerful entity because it seems that nothing happens without it. We actually had an outage on Bamboo earlier this weekend, and it was painful because nothing could get pushed. And that just wasn't fun.
I mean that's the nature of distributed systems, right? You have a distributed system when a computer that you don't control can bring everything to its knees.
Sure. But with Cloud Foundry, it's like I know the light version exists and things of that nature, but what I would like to test is more complicated than a light version I think can handle.
So let me jump in here. By the way, hi, I'm Zach.
I'm Shannon.
Hi, Shannon. I work on the core CF release team at Cloud Foundry, and so I want to start by caging everything I'm about to say, and it's going to sound, I don't want to say defensive, but I want to sort of drive out like, why are you asking these questions? Like, let's figure out what your situation is and talk about. Andrew was exactly right when he said to me, like, we should really be talking about what are the trade-offs when you start deploying Cloud Foundry in configurations that have a much smaller footprint than what our defaults are. But I guess the question I have for you is, you want to deploy Cloud Foundry with some, simple services at RabbitMQ or at databases, whatever, and maybe have CI feeding into that. And I guess the question I have is why can't you do that with CF Lite? Why can't you do that with, super co-located VMs that don't necessarily have an HA guarantee? And like, what's to stop you from deploying a service broker that brokers a RabbitMQ deployment somewhere else that you've deployed, because right, you don't deploy RabbitMQ with your Cloud Foundry.
Sure.
And so what's to stop you from pushing a service broker to Bosch Lite that can handle your RabbitMQ deployment? And what's to stop you from then pointing your Bamboo at that Bosch Lite?
I'm looking at the lazy, simple way of doing it. That being, ideally, what I want to do is test Pivotal Cloud Foundry, not just Cloud Foundry. And we use AWS. We've got, I don't know, 6 servers left in the server room, and when they're gone, there will be no more.
Right.
So, you know, AWS, be it good or bad, is where we're putting everything. There only seems to be that one option of the all or nothing style of deployment to AWS without manually going through it and deploying it that way. And I guess that's my biggest question or concern or whatever you want to call it, is it would be nice to have a lighter, smaller version to be able to throw out there that would be less expensive from an EC2 instance usage perspective.
Right. So I think, you know, looking at the way that because there's Cloud Foundry as an open source project, and then there's Cloud Foundry, Pivotal's Cloud Foundry as a product, and there's obviously like a lot of overlap, and you know, one's a superset of the other, but there are other pressures that are going to drive that Pivotal Cloud Foundry product to enable more of what you're talking about, right? And I think that some of the stuff that we're working on with now that the scheduling is basically released, then I think that you're going to see, not to give anything away, but maybe we could talk offline, like ways to have multiple kind of smaller clusters that have a single cloud controller, or like other things are going to have a smaller footprint, but still have kind of more, as you said, in the middle with respect to both the footprint and the promises. It's just a matter of engineering that, and you could probably solve most of that yourself if you controlled all of the BOSS manifest. Like if you were the one writing all the ways that you wanted to deployment, you could make those decisions yourself. It's just it takes some time for the opinions that we have and the promises that we want to be able to keep to our customers to migrate into what we bless as a product release.
And to be fair, speaking as somebody who works on the open source project and not on PCF, all I can say is my understanding is that you can't actually deploy PCF with Bosch. Like, you don't need Ops Manager. Although we certainly maybe recommend that for consumers of PCF. I'm not involved in that side of the development, so I don't necessarily have the expertise on that, but what I can say is that there's nothing necessarily to stop you from using Bosch directly to deploy PCF with a smaller footprint and point your CI at it and point it at services.
And I've kind of suspected that.
Yeah.
I guess more of my thing is just maybe from the PCF guys versus the CF side, but make a smaller one. Easy.
Yeah.
But picture another scenario, and this has got to come up, or I would assume it does. Let's say it's an AWS-centric only user, and you want the PCF dev and the PCF production. Well, if I can make my PCF dev a little smaller and a little less painful from a EC2 usage perspective, that would be really nice to have that dev version that small.
Here's a question. Why not just have the dev version and the prod be in the same pool?
Use different orgs and spaces for that.
Yeah, it's reasonable.
But here's the thing that's happening. I don't know. Pivotal doesn't make promises on timing, but there's definitely some interesting scenarios. And if you just think about what it would take to do, if you think about something that has like multiple endpoints, right? The way Cloud Foundry was originally envisioned is it's sort of this collection of fungible resources in a cloud that's sort of a centralized pool that is your back end. But then if you think about scenarios where you have multiple places that are all going to have software maybe point of sale or some kind of Internet of Things scenarios, then what does it look like to give someone the Cloud Foundry experience and to manage, what are really a collection of edges instead of like a centralized cluster?
Mm-hmm.
And those scenarios are driving a bunch of things that I think will end up actually solving the problem that you have, where you're going to be able to manage a bunch of little clusters of various shapes and sizes through kind of like a single cloud controller.
Okay.
But that, I don't know when that actually manifests itself, but there's definitely conversations and the needs of certain projects and clients are pushing things in that direction.
Yeah. Even scenarios where, let's say it's an upgrade, and you need to upgrade the PCF installation. I would prefer to do my first upgrade on something other than the production version.
Sure.
And then that falls back into having that smaller, lighter footprint version, just to kind of make sure that we understand the upgrade process, that everything's working. And a lot of this comes from my ignorance of Cloud Foundry. Have I messed with the light version? Yeah, but I don't feel like it's would be the same as having quite the full-blown version.
So, I'm sorry. You can see I'm a little tired. I'm gonna say goodbye. Shannon, it was great to meet you.
Well, unless Shannon wants to hang out all night, we can go and we can have some more conversations offline. But I think normally we have a few other characters, but everyone's going to conferences this week.
Mm-hmm.
There's DockerCon's going on right now in Barcelona. There's QCon and Structure this week in San Francisco. So a lot of my team's already kind of on the road and scattered around the earth. But I had a great time talking with you, Zach. Thanks for coming on. You can come back anytime.
Yeah. Hopefully I'll be here next week. Shannon, all I have to say to you is that next time you're in San Francisco, should come sit with my team. Let's pair on deploying Cloud Foundry.
Sure.
So, yeah, please visit us.
Okay.
All right.
And we'll call it a Cloud Foundry After Dark. We'll call the episode. But if you want to hang out for a minute, Shannon, I'll chat with you.
All right. See you guys.
Cheers.